He thought stripping my clearance would erase my name from the system. He didn't realize compliance leaves fingerprints, and federal audits don't forget who signed what. When the $525 million review began, the silence in the boardroom felt like a fuse already lit. The day he told me I wasn't cleared for federal work, the air in the executive conference room felt colder than the steel badge in my palm. Vice President Caldwell didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words slid across the polished walnut table like a paper cut, thin, precise, meant to sting later. "You're not cleared for federal work," he said, leaning back as if he'd just corrected a typo. Around him, the leadership team stared at their tablets with the devotion of monks pretending not to witness an execution. I had spent 12 years building our compliance division from a dusty filing cabinet into a department auditors actually respected. Federal audit procedures weren't just checklists to me. They were choreography. Every contract clause, every signature block, every registered contract officer designation had weight. Remove one piece, and the entire structure tilted. Caldwell knew that. Or perhaps he didn't. That uncertainty gnawed at me more than the humiliation. He tapped the folder in front of him. Legal determined your clearance documentation was incomplete. The pause was deliberate. Incomplete sounded accidental. It wasn't. My badge felt heavier by the second. I slid it off the lanyard slowly, aware of how quiet the room had become. The faint hum of the HVAC system filled the silence like static before a storm. I placed the badge on the table. No theatrics, no raised chin, just a simple, lawful compliance with an instruction delivered in bad faith. What Caldwell didn't say, what no one said, was that I was the registered contract officer on the company's largest federal engagement, a $525 million infrastructure modernization program. My name was embedded in procurement approvals, compliance certifications, quarterly reports. Removing me wasn't like deleting a contact from Outlook. It meant rewriting history. And someone had already started trying. By noon, my email access was restricted. By 1, my shared drive permissions were revoked. By 2, my office keycard failed to blink green. The building that once opened its doors to me with silent respect now treated me like a visitor without an appointment. But compliance leaves trails. I didn't panic. Panic is for people who cut corners. I went home, opened my personal compliance archive, meticulously maintained, entirely lawful, and reviewed my designation letters, renewal confirmations, and federal portal screenshots. Every contract officer appointment had been acknowledged by the agency. Every update logged, every audit response time-stamped. The next morning, an automated notification arrived from the federal vendor system. It was subtle, almost polite. Registered contract officer status under review. Under review, not revoked. That distinction mattered. Inside the company, I later learned, Caldwell had announced that organizational restructuring required a temporary reassignment of federal oversight. Temporary. Another careful word. He appointed someone from operations, smart, ambitious, and utterly unfamiliar with federal audit escalation protocols. You can assign authority internally. You cannot overwrite a federal registration without process. 3 days later, the agency sent an inquiry, not to the company's generic compliance inbox, but to the email on file for the registered contract officer. Mine. They wanted clarification regarding a modification request submitted under my name after my departure. Departure. I read the timestamp twice. It was filed 6 hours after I turned in my badge. My pulse didn't race. It sharpened. The request referenced a cost reallocation, minor on paper, substantial in consequence. A reallocation that, if mishandled, could trigger a full compliance review. Someone inside the company had assumed removing me internally meant my authority externally could be quietly repurposed. It doesn't work that way. I responded directly to the agency's compliance officer with documentation, confirmation of my status, notification that I had not authorized the modification, and a formal inquiry into who submitted it. The tone was measured, factual, precise, no accusation, just process. Hours later, a second notification arrived. Federal audit review scheduled. Scheduled, not suggested, not pending. Inside headquarters, I imagine the mood shifted from smug efficiency to uneasy recalibration. Federal audit is not a casual calendar invite. It's a spotlight that warms slowly before it burns. Caldwell thought clearance was a light switch he could flip. He forgot that federal systems log every hand that reaches for the switch. And somewhere in that building, someone was realizing the question wouldn't be whether I was cleared for federal work. It would be who tried to work federally without me. If you think this ends with a simple correction, you don't understand what happens when compliance notices a missing signature. The announcement of the federal audit arrived at headquarters like the quiet thud of a sealed envelope. No drama, no sirens, just inevitability. By the time I heard about it through a former colleague who still trusted me enough to risk a late-night call, the executive floor had shifted into controlled panic. Not chaos, not yet. Just that brittle over-politeness that creeps into emails when people start copying legal on everything. "They're asking for designation records," she whispered. "Specifically, the registered contract officer file. They want the removal authorization." Removal authorization. There it was. Inside the company, Caldwell had framed my exit as administrative housekeeping. But federal audit doesn't accept housekeeping as a procedural category. There are forms, notices, timelines, a documented transition. The agency must acknowledge the change. Until then, the registered contract officer remains exactly that, registered, and the system still showed my name. The morning of the audit, I wasn't in the boardroom. I was at my kitchen table, sunlight slicing across a stack of neatly tabbed binders. My coffee had gone cold, but my focus was razor sharp. The agency had requested a clarification call. With me, not the company, me. That detail alone shifted the axis. Meanwhile, in the glass-walled conference room downtown, the leadership team assembled under recessed lighting that suddenly felt interrogative. Laptops open, legal counsel present. Caldwell at the head of the table. Posture immaculate. Confidence rehearsed. Across from them sat the federal agent. He wasn't theatrical. He didn't need to be. He wore a Navy suit, government-issued calm in his expression, and the kind of stillness that makes executives over-explain. "Let's begin with the designation history," he said evenly. "Who removed the registered contract officer?" Silence has texture. In that room, it must have felt like sand in the throat. Caldwell cleared his voice. "There was a restructuring." "I'm asking," the agent interrupted gently, "for the formal removal documentation acknowledged by the agency." Paper shifted. Screens flickered. Someone coughed. There wasn't any, because you cannot remove a federally registered contract officer by disabling her keycard. Back at my kitchen table, my phone buzzed. The agency liaison joined our scheduled call, precisely on time. No small talk, no pleasantries. "Ms. Alvarez," she began, "our records show you remain the designated contract officer for the $525 million modernization contract. We've received internal notification suggesting otherwise." "Can you clarify?" I could hear the unspoken question behind it. "Is your company trying to circumvent compliance?" "My designation has not been formally rescinded," I replied, steady and factual. I did not authorize the modification submitted last week. I have documentation of my current status and would like to ensure the integrity of the record. Integrity of the record, not accusation, not emotion, process. She paused. Typed, then, understood. We will require written confirmation from corporate leadership explaining the discrepancy. Discrepancy. In the boardroom, the agent repeated the word like a diagnosis. Your internal memo indicates Ms. Alvarez was no longer cleared for federal work. However, our system reflects no change. Who submitted the contract modification under her credentials? Another silence. This one heavier. I later learned that operations had attempted to push the modification through using existing authorization chains, assuming the transition paperwork could be cleaned up retroactively. A small procedural gamble, a temporary workaround. Federal systems do not recognize workarounds. The agent's pen tapped once against his folder. Not impatient, just present. Until proper removal documentation is processed and acknowledged, he said calmly, the registered contract officer retains authority and responsibility. Any submission under her name without authorization is a serious compliance matter. Serious compliance matter. Those 3 words do not raise their voice. They don't need to. By late afternoon, I received a formal request from corporate legal asking me to assist in clarifying the timeline. The irony almost made me laugh. The same leadership that had escorted me out with security protocol now needed my precision. I agreed to provide documentation through proper channels, not out of vengeance, not for spectacle, but because the record matters. Compliance is not revenge, it is gravity. As the day closed, the agency sent one final notice to both me and the executive team. Pending review of removal procedures and modification authorization, contract activity is temporarily paused. Paused. $500 million suspended in procedural midair. Caldwell had wanted to demonstrate authority. Instead, he had demonstrated absence of process. And in that suspended silence, one truth settled over the company like dust after demolition. You can question someone's clearance in a conference room, but you cannot erase her from a federal registry without consequences. What happens next will determine who actually understands the weight of a signature, and who only understood the title on a door. If you think the audit ends here, you haven't seen what agencies do when documentation doesn't align. Subscribe to follow the next chapter and watch how compliance rewrites the power dynamic, quietly, legally, permanently. By the 3rd morning of the contract pause, the company's glass facade reflected a sky the color of polished steel. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted from denial to calculation. When $525 million stands still, time becomes expensive. Legal requested a formal meeting, with me. Not a hallway conversation, not a damage control email, a documented call with minutes recorded. The invitation was phrased carefully. Clarification of federal audit designation records. Clarification. They still avoided the word mistake. I joined from my dining room, sunlight steady at my back. On screen, Caldwell sat beside General Counsel, posture composed but eyes sharper than before. There's a particular tension that enters a room when someone you dismissed returns holding the documentation. Ms. Alvarez, General Counsel began smoothly. We'd like to resolve the discrepancy regarding your contract officer status. Resolve. Discrepancy. Language can be upholstered to look comfortable. There is no discrepancy, I replied evenly. There is an unprocessed removal request. Caldwell's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected precision. He had expected emotion. I shared my screen, designation letter, agency acknowledgement, renewal confirmation, Federal portal timestamp. Each document appeared with quiet authority, like stepping stones across a river no one else had mapped correctly. According to federal regulation, I continued, removal requires written notice submitted by the contractor and acknowledged by the agency before authority transfers. No such acknowledgement exists. A silence settled, not hostile, just heavy with recalculation. Legal leaned forward. We submitted internal paperwork. Internal paperwork, I said, does not update federal systems. The truth doesn't need volume. Caldwell shifted. The restructuring was necessary for operational efficiency. Operational efficiency, a phrase that tries to outrun accountability. Efficiency, I replied gently, cannot precede compliance. The words hung there, simple and immovable. Then came the question none of them wanted to phrase directly. If the agency determines unauthorized submission occurred, General Counsel asked carefully, what is your position? There it was, the pivot. My position, I said, is that the record must reflect facts. I did not authorize the modification. The company retains the ability to correct its removal process and designate a successor properly. The sooner that is done transparently, the sooner contract activity resumes. No threats, no ultimatums, just gravity. For the first time since that conference room dismissal, I saw it. Not resentment in Caldwell's expression, but concern. The kind that surfaces when someone realizes a maneuver meant to consolidate control has instead exposed fragility. Later that afternoon, the agency sent a formal request for supplemental documentation. This time, it wasn't just about my designation. It was about the attempted modification itself, budget justification, approval chain, internal authorization logs. Logs are unforgiving. Within corporate headquarters, IT began pulling metadata, submission timestamps, credential usage, access history, the digital equivalent of footprints in fresh snow. And there it was. The modification had been routed through a secondary administrator account, approved internally under expedited review. Someone had assumed the external authority would align automatically. It didn't. When the federal agent reconvened the review call, his tone remained neutral, almost patient. We are evaluating whether this constitutes procedural negligence or intentional misrepresentation, he stated. Negligence or misrepresentation. 2 doors, neither comfortable. Caldwell attempted composure. There was no intent to misrepresent. Intent is difficult to prove. Process is easier. The agent turned to me. Ms. Alvarez, do you confirm you were not notified of removal prior to submission? I confirm, I said. No formal notification was acknowledged by the agency. He nodded once, making a note. That single nod carried more weight than any executive title. By evening, an internal memo circulated. Pending full compliance reconciliation, leadership adjustments are under review. Adjustments, the building that once felt like a fortress now felt like a structure awaiting inspection. My phone buzzed again, this time from a senior director I hadn't spoken to in months. You were right, she said quietly. We moved too fast, not malicious, not dramatic, just misaligned with regulation. And in federal contracting, misalignment is expensive. The next agency notice arrived just before sunset. Conditional reinstatement of contract activity upon verified submission of proper removal documentation and corrective action plan. Conditional. The contract was not terminated, not penalized, not escalated yet. It was given a path, a lawful path. Caldwell's authority had been unquestioned inside the company. Outside, in the Federal Registry, authority belonged to documentation. and documentation had not sided with him. What he does next will determine whether this ends as a procedural correction or something far more permanent. The corrective action plan required signatures before sunrise, not metaphorically, literally. The agency's conditional notice specified a 48-hour window for verified removal documentation, successor designation, and a formal compliance attestation. Miss it, and the pause would harden into escalation. Inside headquarters, lights burned past midnight. The executive floor, usually silent after 7, glowed like a ship navigating fog. I received the draft removal request at 11:42 p.m. It was different this time. No euphemisms, no restructuring language, just a formal notice acknowledging my continued status as registered contract officer and requesting agency-acknowledged transition. Accurate, finally. Attached was a second document, an internal review summary admitting procedural oversight in the attempted modification submission. Oversight, a word that carries both humility and liability. Legal requested my confirmation of receipt, not approval, not endorsement, simply confirmation. The distinction mattered. I responded in writing, concise and precise. I acknowledged receipt and reiterated my documentation history. No emotion, no embellishment, because compliance thrives on restraint. At 2:17 a.m., the formal removal packet was transmitted to the agency portal. Timestamp recorded. Confirmation pending. Across town, I imagine Caldwell watched the submission notice appear on his screen. The same system he had assumed would quietly align with his internal decision now demanded structured correction. Authority had reversed direction. Morning arrived with the sky washed pale and undecided. My inbox refreshed at 8:03 a.m. Removal acknowledged, successor designation accepted. Contract activity reinstated under conditional monitoring. Reinstated. Not because of a confrontation, not because of public spectacle, because the record was corrected. Within hours, another internal memo circulated, this one shorter, sharper. Effective immediately. Leadership restructuring within the Federal Programs Division. Restructuring. The word had returned, but it no longer pointed at me. Caldwell's name was absent from subsequent correspondence. No dramatic announcement, no scandal headline. Just a quiet shift in reporting lines. An interim oversight committee installed. Compliance elevated to direct board visibility. Power doesn't always collapse loudly. Sometimes it simply steps aside when documentation refuses to bend. Later that afternoon, I received a call from the General Counsel. "We appreciate your professionalism throughout this process," she said carefully. "The board recognizes the importance of procedural integrity." Procedural integrity. A phrase that sounds bureaucratic until you realize it just saved $500 million. She paused, then added, "There may be opportunities for advisory engagement, should you be open to discussion." Advisory engagement. Irony has excellent timing. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence breathe, just long enough to remind us both that absence of emotion is not absence of memory. "I'm open to reviewing a formal proposal," I replied at last. Calm, measured, unrushed. Because now the leverage was symmetrical. By evening, the federal agent sent a final note. "Compliance reconciliation satisfactory. Monitoring period active. No further action at this time." No further action. In federal language, that is relief wrapped in restraint. The contract resumed. Payments unfroze, project teams recalibrated, vendors exhaled. The machinery of infrastructure began moving again, not because someone asserted authority, but because authority aligned with process. At home, I placed my original badge in a small wooden box, not as a trophy, not as a reminder of conflict, as proof that titles can be removed, but registered authority leaves traces. What the board decides about future leadership will shape the division's culture for years. But one thing is already clear. The next person who questions compliance won't do it casually. And the next contract officer will never be restructured without reading the Federal Registry twice. The board meeting took place on a Tuesday that felt deceptively ordinary. No storm clouds, no flashing headlines. Just a quiet calendar invite titled Federal Programs Governance Review. I wasn't seated at the long mahogany table this time. I joined as an external advisor, formally contracted, clearly defined, legally independent. The irony was almost elegant. 12 weeks earlier, I had surrendered a badge. Now, I carried influence without one. The presentation opened with numbers. Contract reinstated, milestones back on track, audit status shifted from active review to monitored compliance. The Oversight Committee outlined revised protocols, dual verification on contract officer transitions, mandatory agency acknowledgement before system access changes, quarterly federal audit simulations. Simulations. What used to be treated as interruption was now treated as rehearsal. When the floor opened for discussion, a board member, silver-haired, measured, asked the question that had been orbiting quietly since the audit began. How did we allow internal authority to override federal designation? No one rushed to answer. The new interim head of federal programs spoke first. We conflated corporate hierarchy with regulatory hierarchy. Conflated? That single word held the entire lesson. Titles operate vertically. Compliance operates externally. And external systems do not adjust themselves to internal ambition. I spoke only when invited. My recommendation, I said evenly, is to formalize separation between operational leadership and federal designation authority. Registered contract officer status should be insulated from executive restructuring. It protects the company as much as the individual. Protects the company. Not vindication. Not validation. Protection. There's something transformative about watching people listen to you after they once dismissed you. Not because you're louder, but because the record proved you accurate. The board voted unanimously to adopt the governance revisions. Unanimously. No debate, no resistance, just recognition. Caldwell's departure was never publicly dramatized. His profile quietly shifted to strategic consultant for a few weeks before disappearing from the company site entirely. No scandal, no spectacle, just an absence where certainty used to sit. Inside the Federal Programs Division, something subtler changed. Compliance was no longer the department that slowed things down. It became the department that kept the lights on. Quarterly training sessions filled beyond capacity. Managers asked questions before submitting modifications. Documentation moved with deliberate care. The phrase, "Have we checked the registry?" entered everyday conversation like a reflex. Culture doesn't shift because someone wins. It shifts because consequences become visible. One afternoon, months later, I received a forwarded email from a junior analyst. Before we proceed, she had written to her team, let's confirm contract officer acknowledgement in the federal system. 3 sentences, calm, procedural, exactly how it should be. I closed my laptop and stepped onto the balcony, the city humming below in late golden light. The air felt lighter, not triumphant, not dramatic, just balanced. There had been no revenge, no public humiliation, no raised voices in final scenes. There had only been documentation, process, and the steady refusal to let authority outrun compliance. My badge still rests in that wooden box, not as a relic of dismissal, as a reminder that systems remember. And when someone sneers, You're not cleared, the registry may quietly answer otherwise.